Up next, journalist Brian Gresh investigates the central event in what some have called the Cosmic Watergate.
The town of Roswell, New Mexico isn't much different today than it was 45 years ago, when it became the unlikely setting for what may rank as the greatest cover-up in history. The old Army airfield has been closed for years, but back in the late 40s, it was home to the world's only atomic bomber wing, the 509th, a point of pride with the locals. Today, as then, much of New Mexico is a virtual military fiefdom. Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque was and is the state's largest employer. Los Alamos Lab and White Sands Missile Base are still key players in the nation's defense establishment. If someone had wanted to get a clear picture of America's military capabilities back in the 40s, New Mexico would have been the place to be. New Mexico in the late 40s and early 50s was not only a hotbed of military activity, but also of UFO sightings. Green fireballs and other unexplained phenomena had been reported over nearly all of the state's top-secret military facilities on an ongoing basis, prompting hush-hush studies and evaluations. One secret study, dubbed Project Twinkle, concluded that it was doubtful the phenomenon was of natural origin. One reason? When attempts were made to photograph or record the fireballs, they simply moved to another location, as if they didn't want their pictures taken. Twinkle remained classified for decades. By early July of '47, the public was also becoming aware of the flying saucer mystery. Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting had occurred only a few days before, spurring a nationwide sighting spree. But what was seen in the skies over Roswell was different from the other elusive lights. This time, the lights came crashing down. A rancher named Mac Brazel was the first to spot the wreckage in the desert. He first phoned the sheriff, who then called the Army Air Base to report that something had crashed, a decision both would soon regret. The base dispatched intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel, to the scene. Marcel and others gathered up some of the strange material and brought it back to Roswell.
Foil-looking material, about the thickness or thinner than the foil on a package of cigarettes, and that's pretty darn thin. Could not be burned, could not be cut with a pair of scissors, put on the ground and a penknife taken and trying to drive it through wouldn't work. There was no way, it was indestructible for all practical purposes.
Lieutenant Walter Hott was the public affairs officer for Roswell at the time the strange metal was found. He recalls being ordered by base commander Colonel William Blanchard to issue a shocking press release.
He called and said words to this effect: "We've got pieces of what we think is a flying saucer."
The release was picked up by newspapers all over the world, and queries about the flying saucer came pouring in.
The first phone call I got after that got on the wires and the like was from London, England, fellow calling some newspaper, and I don't remember which one it was. "If this is something from outer space, how did Major Marcel know how to fly it?" I said, well, he didn't actually get in it and fly it. He just put the pieces in an airplane and flew the airplane.
But within hours after the initial press release, higher-ups within the Army ordered a new story to be issued. The wreckage wasn't from a flying saucer after all, but rather was part of a weather balloon. A news conference was staged, at which pieces of a shredded weather balloon were put on display. But Major Marcel admitted in later years that the material shown to the reporters wasn't what he brought back from the Brazel Ranch. Marcel said the metal had been spread out over 3/4 of a mile at the ranch, far too much material for a weather balloon. And he said some of the pieces contained strange, inscrutable symbols, as if written in an alien language.
He reiterated that over and over, that what he had seen was not, I'll have to quote here, not of this earth. He was very, very adamant about it.
What Haught didn't know back then was that a second wreckage site, 120 miles from the Brazel Ranch, had also been found, and on the same day. Numerous witnesses, including an archaeology team, say they saw a large crashed disc and the bodies of at least 4 alien creatures. Like the Brazel site, this second location was sealed off by the military, and witnesses were told to keep their mouths shut.
So when you get such a consistency of input from respectable people, people whose testimony you'd like on your side in a court of law, ask any attorney, you're stuck. What are you going to do from there? These people are telling the truth. It's not one person, it's not 10 people, it's over 100 people.
As Friedman reveals in his book, Crash at Corona, dozens of former military personnel have surfaced over the years who say they saw, handled, or transported either the wreckage, the alien bodies, or both. Bob Shirky, the former assistant operations officer at Roswell Field, is one of them.
Colonel Blanchard had called down and said, set up a plane to go to Fort Worth. He said, I want a B-29. And then Colonel Blanchard showed up in a couple of cars, and the people come hurrying into the building, and he stepped in, Colonel Blanchard stepped into this doorway into the operations office to get out of the hallway. And that's when I said, Colonel Blanchard, you're blocking my view, you know. And I peeked over his shoulder as a couple people went by carrying various pieces of metal. And one of them pretty good size, about 2 by 4.
Shirky says he knew other people who had knowledge of the wreckage or bodies, including a nurse at the base hospital who claimed to have seen horrid alien carcasses. Shirky has also remained friends with Glenn Dennis, the town mortician.
He said to me, did you see the sketches in the paper of the humanoids or the bodies? And I said, yes. He says, well, I can tell you that's what they looked like. He says, our funeral parlor supplied the caskets for the Air Force to use because we had the contract. And they came in and took all the baby-sized or youth-sized caskets we had.
When this crash saucer event took place, the military told him, if you ever talk about what you saw, we will kill you and we will kill your family.
While a cover story was being spoon-fed to gullible media, more dramatic steps were taken to ensure that the story of the saucer and bodies would spread no further. Mac Brazel, for instance, was held incommunicado for a week, and when he finally re-emerged, had changed his story about what he found. Sheriff George Wilcox confided in later years that the lives of his family had been threatened by the military unless he kept out of the investigation. His own samples of the strange metal were seized. A Roswell radio station was ordered by the FBI to cease transmission of a story about the crash. But the most effective subterfuge involved the transport of the alleged alien flotsam. Witnesses and records indicate that some of the material was immediately flown to Fort Worth, then on to Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio, and perhaps to Washington, D.C. The official Army story is that once the weather balloon mix-up was discovered, plans for transporting the material were canceled altogether, a statement that is demonstrably false. Pilots who flew the material out of Roswell have confirmed the Army was lying. One pilot even claimed to have seen the alien bodies while in flight. This official FBI memo, dated July 8, 1947, clearly indicates that a, quote, disc was being transported from Roswell to Wright-Patterson by a special plane for examination. Wendell Stevens was at Wright-Patterson back then and remembers far more furor than should have been generated by a weather balloon.
My immediate superior, who was Colonel Albert Boyd at the time, later became 3-star General Albert Boyd and the commander of the Edwards Air Force Base Flight Test Center. He was my immediate superior, and he was one of the officers that flew General Twining out to Kirtland Air Force Base on the night of the 3rd of July.
More than 200 witnesses in all have now come forward with bits and pieces of information about the New Mexico events, much of it first-hand information. Yet the official files of those agencies charged with investigating UFOs over the years contain virtually nothing about the case. not even files which might discredit it. There is more than enough evidence to suggest that something extraordinary happened in the New Mexican desert back in 1947, and that the military went to great lengths to hide the truth.
We have the general who took the call from Washington saying to cover it up. We have the rancher, his son, the people around him, neighbors that he talked to. They come up with a consistent story, descriptions of not only the wreckage, but how he was treated by the government. We have the media people in the town of Roswell. Some of them are still alive. We have the guy who put out the press release. He's never changed his story in the 14 years since I've been talking to Walter Howe. We have the FBI memo.
Even more unsettling is the possibility that there have been other crashes and other cover-ups. UFO researcher Linda Howe says she has been shown documents by military officials which refer to several saucer crashes and recoveries. Bill Moore, who co-authored the first book on the Roswell affair, says he has been shown similar documents. And Timothy Good has heard credible testimony from some of the best-known military leaders of this century.
General George Marshall was supposed to have something to do with it. Marshall became quite forthcoming and admitted that there had been contact with UFOs and that there had been at least 3 crashes and occupants had been recovered, and he went on to say that the occupants of UFOs were hoping to eventually adapt to the atmospheric conditions on this planet.
If there have been crashes and recoveries, if alien wreckage and even bodies have been found, where are they? What's being done with the proof? And why can't the public be told? More on these topics is still ahead.
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin.
Retired Marine Corps officer Donald Kehoe is widely regarded as the father of the UFO cover-up theory. In books, magazines, and broadcast appearances during the 50s and 60s, the bulldogish Kehoe became the single most painful dagger in the belly of the Air Force, a relentless crusader who relied on his own military sources to expose Pentagon lies about UFOs, and there were plenty.
They are simply following orders to explain away all UFO sightings as quickly as possible when they become public and deny that UFOs really exist.
The Air Force went to such extremes in trying to explain away UFOs that it lost credibility even with sympathetic media. In the mid-1960s, the U.S. was engulfed in an intensive 2-year UFO wave, during which hundreds of thousands of Americans claimed to have seen UFOs. Alan Hynek, Project Blue Book's designated explainer, inadvertently punctuated the mid-60s flap when he announced that UFO sightings by hundreds of Michigan residents were inspired by swamp gas, an excuse which was ridiculed nationally and which prompted calls for a congressional inquiry into UFOs. Under pressure, the Air Force agreed to sponsor what it called an independent scientific study of UFOs. Several universities declined the job, which eventually went to esteemed University of Colorado physicist Dr. Edward Condon. But any hopes for an objective study were dashed even before the project began. Condon himself stated in public that the government should get out of the UFO business and that UFO writers should be horsewhipped. His project coordinator caused his own stir when one of his memos was leaked, stating that the staff would consist of non-believers and that the, quote, trick would be to make the study appear objective. Several staff members resigned, complaining that the results were rigged. Nevertheless, the Condon report predictably concluded that UFOs weren't worth studying, and the Air Force used the Condon report as a reason to cancel Blue Book altogether in 1969.
None of the evidence that I have examined would indicate any proof at all that we are being visited by extraterrestrials.
We have not been hiding anything. The investigations have been made public. The explanations of those where there is a clear explanation have been made public.
Hynek, of course, would soon change his mind about Blue Book and about UFOs, and would become the most important figure in the history of American ufology. Jacques Vallée was his closest associate.
The Scientific Advisory Board of the U.S. Air Force had many opportunities to review the UFO files. They knew that people like Dr. Hynek and I